and our keynote, Michael Tanner. Michael is a senior fellow at Cato, and his work focuses on poverty, welfare, health, and entitlement reform. He recently published, for this conference, Keeping North Carolina's Housing Affordable, a study focused exclusively on the housing landscape here in the state of North Carolina. I hope all of you will grab a copy on the way out. And this study developed out of his most recent project, a project looking at poverty and inequality across California. So you can see a common trend as we start to look at states across the country. Michael's been looking at this issue for many years, and now to look again more intensely at North Carolina's landscape, I give you Senior Fellow Michael Tanner.
Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate your coming out today. This is really a nice turnout, and we have to thank the John Locke Foundation for helping us get folks here, and I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to be down here. This is actually the second time in, I think, about 2 months that I've actually been able to speak at the City Club, and I appreciate the chance to be here. I wouldn't necessarily let that go to your heads, though. You see, I'm from Washington, D.C., so I'm always happy to be somewhere else. As Chris mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in California recently. We did a 3-year project out there studying bad policy. You might call it a target-rich environment. And they do they're bad in so many ways. I mean, it's hard to add them all up, but one of the areas where they're really a model for the nation of bad policy is housing. They've managed to make housing pretty much unaffordable in their state, which is now driving sort of middle-class Californians out of the state. You've heard a lot about how the population is declining in California. It's not so much that the wealthy are leaving, although, you know, Elon Musk went to Texas and all of that, but it's actually that middle-class people are no longer moving to the state the way they used to, and that's causing a host of problems for the state in the future, because there simply is, they're developing kind of a feudal system where you have a few wealthy people who can afford to live there. You have a few poor people at the end with public assistance of some kind, and then you have the middle, sort of broad middle class is simply being left out, which is a bigger problem than you might think. Well, having finished that project in California and all their bad ideas, we started looking around the country and we said, wow, a lot of other places are where California was a few years ago. And one of those is North Carolina. North Carolina is, you know, if actually California, if you want to look back, say 20 years ago, you could see that the population in California was growing, business was booming, people were moving out there, they had strong economic growth, they had the wonderful California climate, and people were moving out there, and they stopped building housing. And the result was what you see today. Well, you're seeing sort of that in places like North Carolina now. You have tolerable taxes and regulatory policy here to attract business. You have a fantastic climate. You're drawing retirees, you're drawing military, you're drawing new businesses all the time, and that is generating population growth. Not everywhere. You can see some of the rural areas it's falling down, but you can certainly see in the triangle and along the coast and a few other areas where you're getting more and more economic growth, population growth. Essentially, where people are moving to, a lot of people are moving there. Unfortunately, you're not keeping up with that in terms of housing. What you're looking at here is you can see a few years back, and then again this now, and you can see that you never sort of built enough housing to keep up with the population growth. What's interesting is that the problem's actually gotten worse. 10 years ago, you weren't building enough housing for the population growth you were having. Now you're building even less housing for the population growth you're having. The situation is actually growing worse. And if you look to those counties that were actually having significant population growth, you can see that for nearly all of them, your housing construction is not keeping up with that population growth. So you're always sort of one step behind, if you will. You have 10 people move in, you build 8 houses. You have another 10 people move in, you build 8 more houses. Now you're 4 houses behind, and it just keeps building and building and building in that way, where you sort of fall further and further behind. If you don't catch up at some point, you're going to end up in California-style situation. This is sort of, you're starting to see the consequences of in things like rental vacancy rates. You can see in your most populous, that statewide, you're at about 7%. But if you look to The most populous counties, you find that in almost all of them, again, your rental vacancy rate is actually lower than the statewide average. So there's those states, there's those areas where you're having population growth and not building, you're starting to see fewer and fewer vacancies available for people to move into. And as a result of that, you're finding that the more and more people are paying more and more for their rent. The rent burden population is growing larger and larger. It's kind of a, you know, most economists look at this idea, you say, but you spend between 30 and 40% of your income in terms of your housing costs. This is the percentage of people in major counties that are spending more than that. These are people who essentially, they're working folks, they're middle class, they're lower income working folks, but the money that they're bringing in is essentially going straight out in terms of rent or mortgage costs. They're not, and that puts strain on everything else they do. There's less money available for education, less money available for food, less money available for healthcare. They're beginning to have to make tough choices as you start squeezing folks with higher and higher rents and higher mortgage costs. And the reason is pretty simple. This is, you know, sort of not rocket science. A lot of times I dig into an issue and it's very complicated, and it's, well, you have, you know, 100 moving parts, and if you move this, you have to deal with that, and what about this other issue type of thing. Well, more and more we find out that this one is not. This one is simply a question of sort of economics 101, supply and demand. If you reduce the supply of something and keep the demand the same, prices go up. And you look at, you know, you can look at the reasons why prices might go up in an area, why supply might decline. And you can find a few reasons. One is sort of land costs. You know, land is basically a constant. You're not going to discover a whole lot of new land in North Carolina someplace. You might be able to get some of it back from the federal government, some areas, particularly out in the western parts. But you're not going to get a whole lot of new land. I mean, that's sort of going to be a fixed cost. The second part of that is labor costs and material costs. And there's some things you can do around the edges there. You know, tariffs on Canadian lumber drives up costs. Immigration policy can make it hard to find workers, and that's going to drive up costs. Things like that you can do. There's simply, you can do some things around the margins in terms of the cost of building. And the third cost is the cost of actually being able to use that land for housing. And that is where you get into zoning regulations and stuff that restrict your ability to build on that land and make it more expensive if you are going to build on that land. And you pay a price for this. And I can run through just real quickly a few of the areas where I think that you're getting hit. One is slower growth and lost jobs. Businesses are increasingly less likely to locate if they can't find affordable housing for their workers. And there's been surveys of corporations, both surveys nationally, but also surveys of corporations moving to North Carolina, who increasingly say the lack of affordable housing for their workforce is a big problem. And it's one that they take into consideration when they move. It used to be regulations, taxes, those were the only things you had to really consider in terms of trying to attract businesses in, getting an educated workforce, of course, things of that nature. But more and more you're having to consider, can they afford to live here? And if they're moving in and the median price of a house is in the $500,000 range, they're not going to be able to bring their workforce with them. And that means they're less likely to relocate here. So you're going to see slower growth in the future. As a result of this, you're going to see fewer jobs created than you otherwise would. Second, you see an increase in poverty and homelessness. We know for a fact that concentrations of people having this rent burden situation makes poverty worse. So you can go back to the work of Raj Chetty and others. When you take low-income populations and rent burden populations and people who are basically struggling, and you force those people into certain concentrated areas, you sort of redouble all the social problems that go with poverty, one on top of another. And if you have basically housing in most areas that's unaffordable, what you do is you're sort of ghettoizing the poor, if you will, forcing them into these areas where there's a handful of places they can afford, and not letting them move to other areas where there might be more jobs, where there might be better schools, where there might be more opportunity for them. Essentially, and then you create all the social services kind of rush into these low-income areas, and you essentially create locations where there's simply nothing available except for poor people. There's no jobs. There's higher crime. The schools aren't as good. What you want to do is break down those barriers, and as long as housing is too expensive, you're not going to be able to. Third is you have racial segregation much more pronounced than it otherwise would be. It's very hard to talk about zoning, actually, without talking about the history of race. If you go back in American history, the first zoning law in the nation was actually in Los Angeles, and it was pretty limited zoning law. It was basically differentiating between commercial and residential zoning. It was designed to separate those two. But the second was in Baltimore, Maryland. And that zoning law, as part of the zoning law, actually it prohibited you from selling or renting to anyone who was not already the majority race on that block. That was then copied in many other areas around the country, in Richmond, Virginia, and Birmingham, and in several places in North Carolina. Winston-Salem and several other cities in North Carolina copied that as well. The Supreme Court actually threw that out. And it's a very surprising decision in the 1920s. The Supreme Court actually struck down the idea of racial zoning and said that that was a violation of property rights. And unable to zone by race, a number of communities simply, Winston-Salem simply passed a law and said, we don't care what the Supreme Court said. But other areas simply said, okay, we can find other ways to keep African Americans out of our community with zoning. Now, that kind of continues on today in a very different way. Nobody is sitting there today saying, I'm in favor of height restrictions in my neighborhood because I don't want African Americans to live there. Nobody's thinking that. But it has the same impact today because what you have is people who can't afford to move into those neighborhoods don't, and you have such a difference in racial difference in income that you're basically continuing the segregated patterns that existed in the past are being perpetuated into today, which is why housing is so segregated in North Carolina. Next up is environmental concerns. If you worry about these things, the fact is you're increasing driving time, commuting times. We know that multifamily housing uses less energy than does single-family units. We know that if you force people to live further and further away, and commuting times in North Carolina are increasing steadily, that means more time in cars, more time with cars idling. That adds to environmental concerns. And then finally, this is one that I'm for the dynamism of people moving around and what have you, but a lot of people have mentioned to me as I've come to North Carolina and studied the issue, the impact on native North Carolinians who are being basically priced out of their market in their own neighborhoods. It's being brought up repeatedly that you have people coming in from out of state who have more money and are able to bid up prices or to bid for the prices as they go up. That means that native North Carolinians can't compete in those markets and are forced to move further and further out. And you end up with cities like Charlotte where about 55% of the population was born outside the state. So that's an increasing problem. If you're concerned about it, it also relates to the housing issue. So what would a reform agenda look like? Well, it should end exclusionary zoning. Now, I should sort of define exclusionary zoning here because all zoning laws exclude. I mean, that's sort of the nature of what zoning is. If you're telling people that they can't build a hog farm in your neighborhood, you're excluding hog farms. So all zoning to some extent excludes. But what we're talking about when we're talking about exclusionary zoning is those laws that are specifically designed to keep different types of housing and different type of people out of your neighborhood. We're talking about things like single-family only zoning. We're talking about things like parking requirements. We're talking about things like height restrictions or setbacks from the road, minimum lot sizes, the aesthetic zoning where it has to look a certain way. All sorts of requirements that are essentially designed to keep housing prices up and to keep multifamily housing out of your neighborhood. In terms of reform agenda, I think there's some low-hanging fruit out there that should be relatively easy to deal with. One of those is, for example, accessory dwelling units, ADUs. You know, some of the cities have made them easier. Raleigh, I know, has. Durham, some other places have made it easier to build ADUs. But there's no reason why that shouldn't be statewide, that ADUs should be permitted everywhere. Parking requirements are one of the least defensible of all these restrictions. The fact that you have to have 1.5 or 2 parking spaces for every new apartment you build. There's nothing in the economic literature at all that says they do any good, and they are very restrictive in terms of preventing new housing. That should be something that you can do. California, for all its bad policy, has made ADUs legal statewide for a couple of years now, and has just passed a law that would eliminate parking restrictions within a half mile of mass transit. So I think if you know, you should be able to do as well as California on these things. Some others that are tougher, I think you're going to have to deal with lot sizes. I think you're going to have to deal with setbacks. I think you're going to have to deal with height restrictions. These are sort of around the edges, but they all limit your availability of housing. I think you're going to have some limitations of those. And then finally, you're going to have to permit multi-family housing in more areas. And maybe you start with duplexes, or maybe triplexes or townhouses. Maybe you don't go all the way to building a 40-unit building the first time around. I would, but then I'm kind of a radical Cato guy. You know, but certainly you should be able to have a duplex almost anywhere in the state. I think certainly something like that is sort of common sense, kind of low-hanging fruit type of availabilities on that. And lastly, I think you need to change overall the system in which zoning is, or building is permitted from secondary review, which sort of builds on the NIMBY forces, gives them the ability to come in and create havoc and drag things out and increase costs and delay everything. I think what you need to have is what's called by right or a ministerial review. Basically, if you meet all the requirements, you've done all the paperwork right, you've met all the zoning issues that are there, the function of the planning board or the selectmen or the city council or whatever is simply to rubber stamp at that point and say, okay, we've done it. It's simply a process that approves it once and for all, and then it's not sort of dragged out through these constant re-review type of process. And what if localities don't act? Should the state government act? I would argue that the state government in this case should, and for a couple of reasons. One is, as long as North Carolina, from my understanding, and I've gotten the argument on both sides of this, but my understanding is you're basically a quasi-Dillon rule state where the authority derives from the state legislature, particularly for zoning. I know there's some people who have been some court cases that have sort of argued the other, that you're a home rule state, but sort of kind of falls in between the two. But I do think the state has passed zoning laws in the past. In fact, the setting out the scheme for zoning statewide has been set out by the legislature. So I think the legislature has the authority to intervene in this case. And second, even though I'm a general believer in local rule and local government, and the government that governs closest to people governs best, we should always remember that this subsidiarity in terms of government is a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. And if that local rule violates property rights, if that local rule institutes bad policy, it's not necessarily sacrosanct. We should have the ability for the state government to intervene in those cases and say that you can't screw up your local zoning ordinances any worse than they already are, or something like that. Anyway, I would suggest you take a look at the paper. All the numbers are in there, and the details, better view of those charts than what I ran through. And at that point, I'm happy to take any questions you might have for the next couple of minutes. Then we've got some great panels this afternoon that will give you much more detail and much more information than I just did. So if you want to start, if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Hi. Hello, thank you. Great presentation. And I'm from the Boston area, and we could learn a lot from a presentation on these issues there. I wanted to simply ask, when we talk about legislation, perhaps being needed to accelerate some of the solutions that you talk about. One of the things that has struck me is that the higher the prices of housing, the more revenue in property taxes goes to the legislature and local authorities that they have in their pocket for their reelection and for their exertion of decision-making into the civil society. And I don't see, given that kind of point of view I'm asking about, why there would be any interest in having property taxes be lowered and revenue reduced to the state and to the politicians.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one we did not run into as much in California because they have Proposition 13 out there, which limits the amount of property taxes that you can have. What they've then turned to was fees on the developers for the new building. And in fact, if you look at our California report, we talk in there about perhaps capping the fees or making them uniform statewide, because a lot of people found, oh, we can milk the contractors, and that's a great source of revenue that nobody gets mad at because everybody hates contractors. So we can sort of go after them. We also noticed that there's some new studies that are out there. In fact, I think we just did some stuff at Cato on the fact that property taxes are particularly hard on renters. That multifamily units tend to be taxed at not necessarily at a higher rate, although in some places they're actually taxed at a higher rate. But the way the revenue or the taxes strike them forces up rents. They're particularly hard on rent. If you already have a hugely rent-burdened population, increasing property taxes sort of just passes through, and the renters ends up having to pay more, which you have to watch out for. So yeah, I mean, you know, we've got a lot of politicians in the room, and I don't want to say anything, but you know, the idea of here's more money is something that most politicians don't turn down easily. So there has to be sort of a movement on the other side, and that's what we hope we're building here today.
Those nasty politicians, yeah. One of the things that I run into, because I'm a builder also, and I get the chance to listen in my community. I'm from Union County, and there's a lot of growth around Union County, one of the top growing counties, is that this, I call it very, very secretive, but yet it's out there. It's designed to limit the size of homes that can be built. And what it is, and the gentleman kind of touched on a little bit, is the bigger the home, the more property tax you pay. And the calculation by county people, the tax, you know, as well as those who get the revenue, is that certain size homes at some certain break.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Folks, we're going to have a 15-minute pause here, and then we're going to be starting off with our first panel. As Jordan from the Locke team mentioned, our first panel will be representing from the nonprofit and the private sector, discussing the problems that we're facing today. And then we'll be moving on from there to a public sector panel discussing possible solutions. So bear with us. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thanks so much. make sure to. Alrighty then. Welcome back, everybody. Again, my name is Chris Hansford. I'm Director of State Government Affairs for the Cato Institute, and want to thank you again for joining us today. We now have our first panel from the private sector and from the nonprofit space. The three gentlemen to my left, introducing first Tim Minton. He's the Executive Vice President of the North Carolina Home Builders Association. He's also a founding member and past president for Operation Homecoming, a nonprofit that builds custom homes for injured combat veterans returning to their families. Next to him is Bill Rowe, an attorney and current senior advisor to the North Carolina Justice Center. That is a nonprofit focused on poverty issues for North Carolinians. Bill has been at NC Justice since 1992, giving him decades of experience on landlord-tenant issue law, and he has a passion for making housing affordable across North Carolina. At the end, I'm joined today by Brent Woodcox. He's a founder of YIMBY Raleigh, a housing advocacy organization focused on local government in the city of Raleigh. And he also serves as senior policy counsel to Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger at the General Assembly. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me today. So I thought we'd kind of start off going down the line. Each gentleman introduce yourself a little bit and talk about why you care about housing and what do you think the state needs to do to move this in the right direction?
Sure. I'm Tim Minton with the North Carolina Home Builders Association. I represent 14,600 members across the state. We're actually the largest state home builders association in the country. And obviously housing is important to my members, and affordable housing is important. Basically because we just want people to be able to buy that first home. If you don't buy the first one, you can't buy the second one or the third one. And we recognize that that is where wealth is accumulated, is with housing. And so we want to do everything we can to make sure everyone has that opportunity to buy that first home.
Well, it's amen to what Tim said. And we were talking beforehand that probably the Justice Center and the home builders have agreed probably 99% of policy matters related to housing over the years. And for any anti-poverty effort, home ownership is the best way for people to build wealth, and it's build generational wealth. And oftentimes we think of housing as somewhat of a ladder, and that you start rental housing that's affordable, so you can build up your credit and save, and then you can get into home ownership, and you can maybe get a bigger house. But that all those pieces have to work, and when any of those rungs are pulled out, it makes it really difficult for folks. And housing's critical for families, obviously, their health and their well-being, how children do in school, but it's also for the broader community. If you don't have affordable housing, if you have segregated housing, you have a difficult access to finding safe, decent housing, this community is going to suffer. And we heard from the report earlier that businesses will be suspect in moving somewhere where their workers can't find affordable housing and people can succeed. So it's a big deal. I'm heartened that we're here. I don't often work with the Cato Institute, but I do work with the John Locke Foundation, and I'm encouraged that something positive can happen this session.
Brent?
I think that probably the first thing I want to say is I'm excited to be here on a panel where I get to talk about problems. Typically when I'm down at the General Assembly, I have folks that want to ask me, well, don't come to me with a problem, come with a solution. Not today. Good luck, Senator Newton. Good luck, Senator Moffitt. I'm also excited to be with these two guys. I think it's really important this conversation is happening on the right. Both these guys have more experience with housing policy than me and know about the conversation, and it's one that's been going on the left for a long, long time, and it's good that on the right we're talking about market-oriented solutions. So that's enough throat clearing. What is the problem? Well, I think the problem is people. To quote the lyrical poet Taylor Swift, "Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me." If men were angels, there would be no need of government, and there would be no need of housing policy. You didn't think you were going to get Taylor Swift and Federalist 51 quoted at you this morning when you woke up, I bet. So I think that's how I approach this. Why I started YIMBY Raleigh, because I realize this is a human foible. It's one actually that is quite good in certain contexts. Fear of change, fear of unknowns coming in the future. That's what is the base instinct. It's helped our fight or flight instinct for thousands of years. It's a basic element of human psychology and evolution. But here it's one that we actually need to overcome. We need to overcome it because it's not leading to the outcomes that we actually want for people, which is opportunity to work, to live, to raise a family, to go to school, to educate yourself, and to avail yourselves of all the things that we're trying to bring to North Carolina to make it a better state. And so housing is key to that, and that's why I got involved in this and see it primarily as a policy and political problem, one that I want to try to work to solve.
To kind of start off our panel, Cato recently did a housing policy study across the country, and we did a poll as part of that, asking Americans their thoughts on housing, affordability, and all these different pieces. And the biggest piece that I wanted to kind of throw out to you and get your reaction to it is that a majority of Americans in our study, or in our poll, don't think they can afford the house they live in today. If they were on the market, they could not afford their current home. What is that as an environmental factor across our economy and in people's lives and in your cities reflecting? What is going on and causing that to happen, do you think?
Well, I think the first thing I would ask everybody is, how many of you go to Zillow and check the price of your home? I mean, that is, the ability to get that information, I think, drives a lot of that too. Obviously, the housing costs have accelerated in terms of wages. When you go back and look 20 years ago, it was much more comparable, but that's not the case anymore. And that's really our concern, is not so much the market today, but when we look at the market 10 years from now, what's it gonna look like? Are we gonna be like, say, a state of New Jersey, where a person who owns a home is because their parents own that home and their grandparents own that home, and it's instead of the individual themselves? I mean, I remember the first time I bought a home, and still remember that opening the door the first time and how excited I am. And I was telling Senator Newton this story beforehand. I had a young lady who was cutting my hair last week, and how excited she was. She had just bought a mobile home. She was so excited. She was going to move out of her parents, her and her husband, going to move out of her parents' house, and just how excited she was. And so the problem is the economics have not kept up. And wages are only going to go up so much. So what we've got to do is address it on the supply side. And how we do that's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, for me, I've represented low-income communities and families for probably 30 years here in North Carolina. And the poll is interesting because for those families I've represented in eviction cases or in foreclosure matters or just trying to get through life, housing affordability has always been a big problem for low-income people. And it's been a tremendous disconnect of income and wages. And it gets even worse for older adults on fixed incomes and people with disabilities. So that issue has always been out there. I think it's getting broader with the supply problem that we have, so it's hitting other people. But we have to address, there has to be, and I don't know if I'm going to make any enemies when I say this, but there has to be some intervention besides just the supply problem. That if it's only aimed at increasing more housing, I don't believe that will get to the affordability questions for people who are earning certain amounts of their incomes. And so I think it's a both and, to be perfectly honest with you. And I know Tim and I have talked about this and his predecessors. It's somewhat of a math problem. Land costs a certain amount, and you got to find workers, which is a whole nother problem that we could probably explore. And you've got to finance it, and you got to build it, and then somebody has to be able to pay enough so that you can do it and make some money. And so there's some folks who just don't have enough income to make that happen, and that's where there needs to be some intervention occurring. And there's some great, I know we're not going to do the solutions, but there's some great tools in North Carolina. The North Carolina Housing Trust Fund is a great source. The Workforce Housing Loan Program is a great source. The legislature has really stepped up its funding to try to help people with disabilities stay in their homes, and that usually requires rental assistance. So the tools are out there. We just need to commit to getting them done.
Yeah, and I agree with Bill absolutely on the math problem aspect of this. One of the things that I learned in my research about Raleigh is that in Wake County alone, we needed 450,000 new housing units in about 20 years. affordable housing units, and that we were only building about 1,500 a year. So we were just never going to catch up. It was a hole that we were digging for ourselves that we would never get out of if we didn't change something. And a big part of that change was going to be opening up supply, because like you said, you have to. Developers don't do this for free. They like to make a little money, and they'll argue that they don't make enough money, but they have to be able to be in this for a for-profit business. The government itself can't subsidize to the level that we can get everyone in a house using just government subsidy. If we did, we'd end up taxing people at such a high rate that we'd actually lose their ability to afford housing. So we need both and. I absolutely agree with that. And when you deal with people and the problem of NIMBYism, one of the ways that you have to overcome that is, I think it's imperative for us to explain to people what they're gaining. You're not going to get people to give something up that they have, which is what they currently enjoy about their own neighborhood, what they currently enjoy maybe in their property value or anything else. Whether it's monetary or it's just their pure aesthetic preference, you're not going to give them to give something up unless you give them something in return. So you have to explain to them, we're actually in a very good position in Raleigh where people actually want to live here. Go to a place like Detroit that's emptied out. That no one wants to live there anymore, and it's actually revitalizing in its own way now. But you'd rather be on the upslope than on the downslope. And so you see, new coffee shops opening near you. You see new gyms, churches, whatever, schools, things that you need in order to have the life that you want. They're coming, and they're following people. So when people are coming here, it's a good problem to have, but it's one that we're going to have to be proactive in trying to take the right approach to. Otherwise, we end up like California. We're lucky that we've had this disease kind of diagnosed early so that we can actually take proactive steps in order to make sure that we can live healthy as a community in light of what's happening.
I like that analogy, because when you look at the progress of a disease, you don't just get, you don't become fatally ill just one morning, right? It creeps up at you over time, and there's problems, there's signs, there's symptoms. Reflectively, over your different amount of time working on this issue, thinking back to the North Carolina of 2010, 2000, even back to 1990, has this issue gotten worse? Has it gotten better? What is your experience in getting to where we are today? What has driven us to be in the position that we are as a state today?
Being a North Carolina native, which is becoming, eventually we'll end up at the zoo. This is what a North Carolina native looks like. And barbecue is a noun, not a verb. I mean, that'll be I count all the delis that we're now getting across the place.
Very un-North Carolinian.
Very un-North Carolinian, yes. What we've seen is North Carolina transform, and where it was all agriculture and manufacturing, and I think in the early 90s when we kind of had a mid-recession, we discovered then that North Carolina really needed to change, and so the legislature really started changing its policies. It's been accelerated here over the last 12 years in the sense of really focusing on where does North Carolina need to be. And so we just see North Carolina is just a whole different state now, and the housing needs are so different. And the problem is that cost. I mean, that cost goes in there. We were talking about basic math problems. I just thought about it. The other thing we never talk about is mortgages, in the sense of if you borrow $300,000, you don't pay back $300,000. You pay back $450,000, $500,000. So that you have all these different pieces that come together. We are dealing with the fact that North Carolina has done a wonderful job putting itself in the position it's in. Number one in business. We're always top 10 and all these different things. So everyone's moving here. Right now, studies show that only 42% of North Carolinians can afford a single-family home. That's it. So why are we growing? It's because all these people are coming here. That's why we're growing. Well, at some point, North Carolina will not be the shiny ball. There'll be another state. So what happens then when those folks aren't moving to North Carolina?
Yeah, I would agree with Tim, as I always do. So I think that's a good way to start every response here. But
Let you go first next time.
I'm one of those people that came from elsewhere, but it was about 1980, 80 or so. And I worked in Charlotte and Concord, representing low-income folks. And so the state has changed dramatically. I mean, the jobs people did are different. People could own a home and work on a mill, to be perfectly honest with you. Now those mill jobs are gone, and I think home ownership is really out of reach for folks. But the numbers of folks who are working that I see having trouble being cost burdened, as the report talks about, some people paying more than 50% of their income for costs of housing, has grown, I believe. I just think that it's steeper climb for people each day, and that's what's made it different. So with all the growth and the great strides ahead, and we have great universities, our schools are getting better, there's businesses here, but there's a group of folks who work and don't make enough money to make ends meet, and that's a big problem. And I think that may be a little like the disease, because some people always say, well, when sort of some rich folks get a cold, they sneeze, but when poor folks are getting a cold, they may get pneumonia, and it's because they're struggling with so much. I would also say that the access to housing, I've seen that more and more that grow. There's a lot more people looking at the backgrounds of tenants before they rent to them, and I think people who are struggling usually have bad credit, and so that can foreclose them from finding a place. Criminal records of any family member, and there's not much of a any standard about how those ought to be used, how long ago and who. And another one we've just recently discovered, and we're hopeful that this General Assembly might look at, is the use of eviction records. And we went through a terrible time with COVID, and there were a lot of eviction filings made. But a lot of those cases got resolved and settled. And if you look back over the years, about 40% of eviction cases end up in favor of the tenant or resolved. But the background checkers just look, did they get an eviction case filed against them, and then they get denied housing because of that. So part of there's a lot to look at, but I think it's an inclusive piece, and that will all benefit from looking at these other non-market issues that are out there that the market can't solve for some of these folks. And I got some more, but I'll wait till my next time around.
When you talk about those mill jobs, one of the things that I think is exciting about North Carolina, when you look at per capita income and per capita wealth across your state, it is moving in the right direction, right? North Carolina is innovating. You're providing better, more high-quality jobs, better paying jobs for people as they come to your state, which not every state can brag about, right? You talk about Detroit, you talk about places that have emptied out, and it's because they have failed to do that. But I think the thing to me that's most concerning, especially when we looked at California, is there's a certain tipping point where wages and the price of housing separate. And that has already started to happen and become somewhat dramatic here in the state of North Carolina. You're certainly not where California is. They're very far down that path, and I don't know if it's possible to turn it around after a certain point. But you've already had that separation. So as your wages are rising, it's not that housing, and people are unable to afford their houses that they're in today because they've lost a job and the economy is bad and things are getting worse. In their daily lives, things are getting better, but the housing is just walking away from them. And in some places, it is running away from them. When you look at Raleigh, is that, your kind of experience as a city?
Yeah, I do think that you're getting that kind of bifurcated rich versus poor, and the poor getting left behind and not actually getting the benefit from this growth. I think that's a problem. It's a political problem that's working its way out in elections that we've had recently. And it's one that talks about gentrification, talks about neighborhoods that have been redlined, that have been, as they said, racially segregated over a long period of time, that have been ignored, not catered to. And then you have the opposite problem, which is when you come in and you make public investments in places like Dix Park or something like new public amenities on Fayetteville Street, all the rest of it, you have problems that become about, well, when that public investment comes, then people want to live there. If people want to live there, whoever lives there now might see their rents increase. They might not be able to afford it or even see their property taxes because their land value increases go up to the point where they can afford to pay their mortgage, but they can't afford to pay their taxes, so they're forced out. You have to be able to cater to native North Carolinians. I personally was born and raised in Kentucky. And as many have said, I went here for college. I got here as fast as I possibly could. Personally prefer Eastern barbecue, but I like anything that you smoke long and hard overheat, okay? But I think we owe it to native North Carolinians to make sure that everybody benefits from this growth, because the project that we're trying to build doesn't exclude people. It's trying to create opportunity and open it to all people. And if people don't want to live here, they want to move out to a rural area. I just read the other day that of the top 10 most populous states, we're the most rural in nature. There's plenty of land out in rural areas if folks want to move there. And you're seeing this with remote work, with firms that might be stationed in other states but can pay a remote salaried worker that might want to work here, pay our lower taxes if they work here, and all the rest of it. this is going to continue to be a problem where native North Carolinians are getting outbid by folks that are coming in, and we've got to be able to find a way to balance those two things.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, when you're replacing your own homegrown population, something's deeply wrong. And this kind of speaks to why we named this event Keeping Housing Affordable, because it isn't just one solution of affordable housing or market rate housing or different kinds of housing. It is about making the housing that anyone can afford within their bracket of life work for them. When you're looking to build homes, or your members are looking to build homes, what drives affordability in your experience?
Well, I think
What drives? I guess the better question is, what drives inaffordability?
Yeah, so zoning is obviously the biggest challenge. Our study showed 24% of the cost of a house is regulations. And the best way I can describe zoning, because a lot of times people don't focus on what's the process you go through to actually get a house built. And instead of using housing, I'm going to use if I were a restaurant owner and I went to the local government and said, I want to build this, I want to have this restaurant. The local government would say, let me have your menu. I see you got a hamburger here that's an $8 hamburger. Well, we really don't like that type of meat for hamburgers, so we want you to use a different type of meat. And the bun that you have, no, we don't want you to use that bun. We want you to use a different type of bun. And while you're at it, how about free beer for everybody who buys this hamburger? And if you do that, we'll approve your restaurant. I mean, that's really how it works. So now that hamburger has gone from $8 to $25. Well, no one can afford that hamburger. And so what we have in North Carolina is not called zoning. It's called rezoning. Rezoning means you have to go in and get approval, which means that you're going to have to agree to conditions to have that approval. Every one of those conditions cost. We have local governments in North Carolina that will not approve a house that has vinyl siding. They won't do it. Go to that. I went to a local government. We talked about affordable housing. I said, what would you do if I came to you today with an affordable housing project? Would you approve it? The response back was, if it meets the standards of our community, we'll approve it. That's exactly what they said.
And those standards are not affordable.
They're not affordable. And I think, to me, that is the problem. If we don't address that problem and figure out ways to solve that problem, I don't care what solutions we come up with, it's just still going to be too expensive to build a home that everyone can afford.
Now, when you talk about standards, right, we want to talk about reducing government burdens on people, but not compromising health and safety, right? When we're talking about these standards, are we talking about insulation? Are we talking about fireproofing?
No.
What are we talking about?
You're talking about aesthetics, the way it looks. We're talking about you can't cut the trees down that are on the lot. You're talking about sidewalks on both sides. We're talking about, hey, we could not fix the road down the street here, but we're going to have you pay to have that road fixed, because even though 10,000 other people drive down that road, you're going to be the one responsible for updating that road. Or you're going to have to pay $1 million to run the water line that you're going to give to the local government once you've done it to run the water or sewer to that subdivision.
Bill, when you're working with low-income families, are they focused on, this is kind of an easy question, but are they focused on what kind of siding is on their house? What's the concern of a family that's trying to get into its first home? Or
No.
just afford housing?
Well, right. I think there's people desperate just to get into some housing that's affordable, and that's rental housing. I think the multifamily, the ability to get multifamily housing built throughout a community is really important, and that's a zoning problem too, because cities have all gone the single-family route. So just opening up more opportunities. But no, you're right. People are looking for a safe, decent, and affordable place. Vinyl siding is just fine with them. There's been some local, I think I've got this right. I might have heard it from Tim, but I don't know. This is when you start repeating something. But I think there have been some local governments that will require a 2-car garage. And that's an expense. Everything is added expense for home ownership. And the one number we have to also address with home ownership is that there's this stark disparity between African American families and white households, and it might be in the paper, but 47% of African Americans own their homes, while 75% of white households own their home. And that doesn't seem right to me, but that requires some intervention. Something's happening there, and it could be the way we set out aesthetics and how much we make things cost. I think minimum lot sizes have really led to segregation and disparities in communities, because if you got a 1-acre lot, that costs a lot more than otherwise, and setbacks. And so I think it does require, I think there's a real connection between the affordable housing advocates, and we all won't agree, and not everyone will agree with me, But I think there's a real connection with the builders, and there's for-profit builders and there's nonprofit developers out there of just trying to get it done, just trying to get something of quality done so a family feels safe and secure in it. And we ought to make that happen as best we can and as easily as we can.
When you're talking about density, I think that a lot of these housing regulations come from folks that live in single-family homes, right? They're able to be proactively involved in civic government, and those are not typically people at the lowest level of the income ladder. They have a lot of more basic concerns going on in their life, for better or for worse. Looking at a city like Raleigh, it feels in some ways where you had these older regulations, it's people that make the rules kind of saying, well, it's what I want. It's the house I want to live in, so it's the house we're going to tell you to live in. When you've started to change that kind of behavior and that narrative, what are the results that you're starting to see?
Well, I think you have a market that's out there for folks that want to live in denser neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that have duplexes, triplexes, apartments, townhouses, all the rest of it. You see that because if you look at the older neighborhoods in Raleigh that are highly sought after, like Oakwood or Boylan Heights or Five Points, where I personally live, they already have all of these things. They were all built prior to zoning. And prior to zoning, you had the opportunity to build a lot more things that people want. Now you have walkable communities that are highly desired, that are in a market highly sought after. Now, it's not that everybody wants to live in that type of community, but we know enough people want to live in there that we haven't built enough of it yet. So why not try? And if we try, then we can bring that affordability down. Bill, I'm glad you brought up the disparity between homeownership, because that's another piece of this. It might be beyond the remit of this particular panel, but you can't hope to have generational wealth build without the cornerstone of wealth, which is a single family home or any type of housing that you own that's passed from generation to generation. That shouldn't be dictated by what zip code you're born in. It certainly shouldn't be dictated by what race you're born into. And that's something that we have to solve if we really care about opportunity and access to what I consider to be the American dream, which is giving your children something better than what you had when you grew up.
Yeah. Just because my personal dream and that of my wife might be to have a single-family home, that's not everybody's dream. That's not the goal that they want. Maybe they want other values in life, but everybody wants to move forward economically. And when you talk about the housing people want, can you talk to us a little bit about, and again, this is a bit of an easy question, do your association members build houses that nobody wants? Do you guys go out and go, well, we really feel like building this, as opposed to what the market is demanding of you?
I'm not aware of that in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and I will say we have seen an evolution in the sense of the product. At one point, townhomes actually were very hard to sell. And now they seem to be more the standard, especially in urban markets. And so, yeah, there is I think that any product right now, if we were built in North Carolina, would sell.
There's a desire for housing,
There's a
period.
desire, period.
And do you find that when local governments are putting their finger on the scale and saying, well, we desire for you to build a certain thing, that desire for other models goes away?
Yes, I mean, it gets back to the math. There's a math problem in terms of affordability. There's a math problem in terms of being able to provide the product. And the more restrictions, the more requirements you add, the cost goes up. And at some point, it doesn't make sense to build denser, because you can make your money better building single family or whatever the product may be. And I think for me, my hope, the challenge I see, we get back to the whole thing about people, is that people have now decided housing is only single family. That's it. That's it. If you don't have that, then you don't have a house. Well, that's not housing, and we've got to get back to. You're talking about the areas here in Raleigh. That's exactly right. It used to be you had triplexes, duplexes. No one thought anything else about it. In North Carolina, 67% of the households can afford a duplex. So all of a sudden we moved from 42% to 67% by just changing the product. So if we are not willing to change the product, we're going to be talking about this for the next 10 years. And I'm hoping down the road, I'm hoping the General Assembly, and I think there's a lot of discussion at that level, is that we've got to look at this model and change it to allow more, literally free enterprise in the system, more options out there in the marketplace.
Yeah. And one of the things that folks that kind of oppose new housing will talk about is saying, oh, well, as Mike had commented earlier, well, if we eliminate zoning, you're going to build a hog plant or a hog farm directly next to my nice suburban home, or you're going to build, a 30-story tenement block in the middle of our rural community. Is that what happens in other places? Do you just plunk these things out in the middle of random places?
Well, and we wouldn't advocate getting rid of zoning. What we would advocate is going more to the way zoning was created, which was to separate industrial from residential. But residential was residential.
It was an all-in.
Now it's R1, R2, R5, R20, R this, R that. It should just be residential. And so that's what we advocate, is the opportunity wherever residential is allowed, that you're allowed to build a variety of products wherever that residential zoning is.
And when you worked on this in Raleigh, Brent, did this just get fixed overnight, or was there a long push for this?
No, I mean, I got involved in this probably a decade ago and finally found some folks that were of like mind that wanted to run for city council and to run on the actual issue. And, you know, when I started YIMBY Raleigh, I mean, this is essentially a social media website that was a one-person show. And I did this on my own, and by the time the election had rolled around, it was in 2019, and it was the News and Observer said it was one of 6 issues that should decide the election. That's pretty good for one person. Unfortunately, we've now moved our city council elections from these odd-numbered years, which have very low turnout, and there's good public policy reasons to put them on the even-number years when more people vote, although now it's at the bottom of the ballot, and there are a lot of other things that people are coming to vote for, and they might not necessarily be paying attention to their city council election. It definitely limits the ability for one person to have a large impact, because I can't just run a website out of, you know, my basement, basically, anymore. You need $200,000, $300,000 to make a difference in an election on this issue, and you have to get people to pay attention. Hopefully, with more advocacy and having the ability to talk about this not just at the local level, but also at the state level and even at the national level, you can draw more attention so that this becomes something that is top of mind for what's being decided from a political standpoint, instead of just like an afterthought.
I think it's actually really telling when you say that, you know, you're talking about this notionally as a one-man website from a basement. If this wasn't an important issue that resonated with voters, that you wouldn't have had an impact, right? Nobody's going to get bent out of shape about one guy talking about leash laws, for example. But you have Americans, and especially North Carolinians, that they're resonating with your message. And if this wasn't a key issue driving affordability for families, you know, you wouldn't have seen the success that you have.
Everybody has to live somewhere. And I mean, and building the type of community where you have the same thing that you have with an economic and job ladder for housing ladder, where when I moved here, I rented for a long time. Then I bought a townhouse that I could afford on my own. And then I've owned 2 different single family homes since I've been in Raleigh. And now I live in a 1,200 square foot house. And when we moved in, just me and my wife, it was great. And now we have 2 kids and a dog, and it's starting to feel a little small. And there are not a lot of places to go, because when I bought that house, it was exactly where I wanted it, for the mortgage I wanted it for, and now it's a whole different market. So, I mean, this is the type of thing that anybody at any point in the income spectrum is dealing with, a squeeze in what their housing costs are versus what kind of quality of life they want to build with themselves with whatever other income that they have.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. I think we're going to turn now to some questions from our audience. We're starting to get a lot.
You mentioned rather than just getting rid of zoning wholesale, just reduce the complexity, take it from R1 through 20 to just R. But where do you see mixed-use developments coming into this in terms of, you know, reducing people's commutes, letting people live in higher density communities so they don't have to use as much gas and things like that?
We're actually big advocates of that, even though most of my members build single family. We think, because it gets back to the whole basic of you got to get into the first structure to the next structure. And I think that's more, they're structures, and they're just different ways of doing it. Land costs, I think Bill mentioned land costs, that's just not going to change. And so the only way, especially in urban markets, is you're going to have to build up. And so, and those alone create communities. And so I think, you know, as we move forward, we've got you know, we've been talking about local control. I like to say local out of control. So, you know, we've got local governments that will not approve any type of multifamily, they ban it all. And so, and these are areas that are actually suburbs of high growth urban markets. And so that's a problem. But I think we've got to be more creative. I mean, it's basic business principles. You got to allow, and if the product sells, it'll be built. So that's the other part.
And if I might add, mixed use, but also mixed income. And there's been a lot of examples of that in Raleigh, where there is market rate, but there's also maybe a low-income housing tax credit property there as well. And that's the best you can do, because we talked earlier about you don't want to just segregate folks in one place. And I think we've learned from housing policy in the past, that's a wrong way to go. So trying to disperse it through the community and have a mixed income along with the mixed use, so you've got the amenities, it ought to be the gold star that everybody's aiming at.
In the back.
do you see?
Yep, you're good. We got you.
So, do you see newer neighborhoods and HOAs as a challenge?
I'll say yes. We have, at the Justice Center, I'll speak for, sees HOAs needing some reform. And they're not an awful bad thing, but there's some abuses there that, and they become almost another third level of government that you have little or no control over. And so there's some reform needs to happen there.
I just want to be able to park my truck in the front of my yard.
How dare you?
Put up your Rudolph reindeer
right.
out there and with the kids.
Hey, Brent, this is a question for you mainly. Going to the people and politics side of things, I think Raleigh passed a lot of policies that sort of are in line with the sentiments up here. Could you sort of reflect on the shift in city council in this most recent election?
Yeah, so I mean, I have my own interpretation of what happened in the city council election and why it happened. I mean, this is a conversation. I mean, Raleigh is obviously a highly Democratic city. I mean, they're probably Biden won Raleigh by 65, 70% of the vote. And what you saw in the last election when it moved it to an even-numbered year, it was a highly politically charged year. It's a partisan election, all the rest of it. Even though Raleigh City Council is technically a nonpartisan office, whoever was on the Democratic palm card ended up winning the election. And so I have my doubts about whether or not intricate conversations about housing policy really dictated the outcome. But certainly there was some blowback. And you see signs in certain areas of the city that say save our neighborhoods. When I see a sign in front of a $2 million house and it says save our neighborhoods, I wonder what that person really needs to be saved from. But I mean, that's fine. I get that. There's going to be blowback. There's going to be a pushback when you push policies like this. And that's why I said at the top, you've got to explain to people in a better way what they're gaining in exchange for what they're facing, which is some fear of the unknown of what could happen. But we kind of have to look to other communities where things like this have happened. Has the sky really fallen? Have housing prices depressed? Have we not been able to make some progress on our appreciation of that asset that we have, which is a home that we own or own with the bank maybe? I don't think that that's really necessarily true. I think that you're finding where these policies are implemented, even more value is coming to the existing neighborhood residents, and that we just need to do a better job of telling our story.
One of the things that I think is always kind of interesting when you talk about, NIMBY organizations or NIMBY people is that the sentiment is typically the same. Save our neighborhood. Keep our neighborhood the way that it is. Regardless of income, class, race, whatever it is, there's a lot of preservationism. They want what they have today. Can any of you give me an example of a community in North Carolina that is the same identical community that it was 20, 30 years ago at all?
If it's a ghost town, yes.
Yeah. So from our perspective, it typically is seen that you have one of two choices. You can either make housing so unaffordable in your community by not building any more. You're going to price out many of the people that live there today, but it is going to look aesthetically the same. You're not going to build anything new. Or you can embrace growth and you can embrace the economic good times that your smart policies from the state have earned you and brought you innovation and industrial development and tech and all that kind of stuff. But there is no locking your town or your city in time.
And it's usually not the natives that are the ones asking for that. It's usually the person who's moved from somewhere else. And when I go speak to groups, I'll usually ask them, are you from here or did you move here? And so, and what you'll see is proportionally a lot more folks who are from somewhere else are more trying to hold on to keeping it the way it is when they got there than folks who were there long before they got there.
I've got mine. It's time to pull up the ladder behind me.
That's right.
Other questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. So the whole point of liberalizing zoning laws is that you reduce the cost of a house or the cost of housing in general. But one of the common objections that's put forward to reforming zoning laws is that if you actually have mass liberalization of the zoning laws, then the widespread cost of housing across the market will depreciate, and all these people who bought houses at, say, $500,000 or $600,000 now have assets that are worth $400,000, and so therefore they stand to lose tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. I suppose my question is, what do you make of that objection, and how do you basically resolve mass ownership of a depreciating asset?
Well,
I'll speak to one matter, and there's numerous studies out there that we could provide to the John Locke folks to get out to people about affordable housing not depressing values in homes and over long periods of time. And that's always been a first argument is traffic. They'll mention crime for whatever reason for affordable housing. And then also you're going to drive our property values down. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't happen. Habitat for Humanity gets that argument as well. And oftentimes their housing product looks better than the ones that are in the community they're building in. So I think it's put out there, but it's not true from the affordable housing side of things. And that includes multifamily housing.
I mean, I think the reality is if, using Raleigh, for example, if all of a sudden tomorrow 5,000 houses came online to sell, prices would drop. They would. It's just a natural thing. But also, there are other factors like supply in terms of what the material costs are. I mean, in the way appraisals work, and that's one of the things I always hear is about the values, is appraisals don't take the house next to the one next door to use as a comparison, unless it's the same type of house, same square footage and things like that. They find like houses to determine the value of that. And so they could be in other neighborhoods. I always look at it, if I think everybody agrees education's important, and everybody believes school buildings are important. And it gets back to, I think you're talking about education. What we haven't gotten to is understanding that housing literally is at that level now, in the sense of it is a necessity. A shelter is a necessity to not just to live, but to be successful. And owning your own shelter is huge. So does our communities 20 years from now, do we want a population that is basically all renters? I have 3 daughters in their 20s. They all 3 can't afford a home in Raleigh right now. I mean, they barely afford their apartments. So I've got one that lives here, and she barely afford her apartment. So, you know, do people want to be like me from a small town northeastern North Carolina, has no jobs, has no nothing? Prices are pretty static there, but there's no opportunity there. And so I think this is part of the mix of being, if you're going to be a society where you want to provide opportunity, you've got to make sure you provide opportunity for everybody. Not just some, but everybody. And the reality is, and this is the thing that people don't recognize, is there are barriers out there for folks being able to purchase that want to own their own home. I told the story of the young lady. Oh my goodness, she was so excited. I mean, that's what we want. Imagine a community where everyone had home ownership. What a different community it would be. Everyone has ownership. Everyone's paying taxes. Everyone's paying property tax. Everybody's doing all this stuff. That's what we need to strive for. And I think the pricing will take care of itself if that's the case.
Well, in cities, I mean, I think they either grow or die. They change. They either change for the better or they change for the worse. You don't see places where people are moving to and want to move to where housing values are actually depreciating. You see them appreciating. The places where you're seeing housing values collapse are rural areas where folks are trying to move out of. And luckily, we have a lot of rural communities that are figuring out, and towns actually that aren't in Raleigh within Wake County, where they're figuring out when they rebuild themselves a downtown and revitalize and try to draw in their own jobs, they actually create more value. A place like Littleton, North Carolina, for instance, has figured out the ways that they can create a small town atmosphere that people actually are drawn to that will actually stabilize and appreciate their housing rather than depreciating it. I think we need to unlock those in a lot of different areas because it's also not an unalloyed good that your housing costs are just going to skyrocket. I mean, a very volatile asset that might be your main source of wealth might not necessarily be what you want. What you want is a slowly, steady increasing appreciation of your home value, because if it increases too fast, you might find yourself house rich but money poor. And then you've got a house that's really great, but if you ever need to move anywhere else, you don't have anywhere to go. So I think that we have to be careful about, obviously you want houses to appreciate and not depreciate, but you want to be careful about the volatility of that as well.
I think that goes back to the point I made in the poll that Cato did to start this discussion off. A majority of Americans surveyed today do not think they can afford the home that they own and that they live in today. For whatever reason, the economy has taken that housing price and stripped it past their income. There was a phase they were able to afford it, they got in, and they could not buy that same house today. And I think that's a fundamental, concern across our economy, especially in North Carolina, where things are moving in the right direction. Other questions? Sorry, with the...
Directly to your comment, what's the historical data on that issue?
We haven't conducted this study before, or we have not polled this before.
So it's a static data point. You've not looked at what was the market in 1970 or 1980 or 1990. Was it equally unaffordable for comparable demographics at the time?
Okay, so you're talking about the housing prices over time, not popular public opinion.
Correct.
Okay, so we do have numbers that are included in Michael's study that both looked at California and now North Carolina, where we compared that to wages. If you look, I believe it's on page 7. That's a very hypothetical page 7. That your housing, we have a nice chart that shows the rate at which wages grow, what wages or prevailing wages are, and the cost of housing per square foot. And over time, and as you got into the 2000s, those two charts separated. So there is clear economic data that shows that the price and the rate at which square footage of housing is increasing in your state past where wages are increasing.
So is it that real wages are not keeping up with the inflationary rate of housing, or is it that for example, the trend here in Raleigh, you look at old Raleigh, if you will, you have the 30 by 30 homes that are basically 900, 1,200 square foot homes, and those homes at $100 a foot or $200 a foot are significantly less than the new homes that are being built that are 3,500 or 5,000 square feet. So is there a correlation between the size of the home being built has escalated beyond the real wages, or is it the actual cost per foot?
It's the cost per foot. So, and I'd give this to Brent, I think, when you talk about a specific city, but where you have a growth in wages that is healthy and within your economy, and you have an artificial regulatory regime that appreciates too aggressively an asset or an asset class that is already in existence, you have a real economic separation.
I think it's one of the damages of having a market that's highly distorted by certain regulations from government. Because yes, we know that currently the product that's most sought after is a 3,500 to 5,000 single family home in most communities, but that's quickly becoming unaffordable. I don't think we've even tapped the demand for smaller homes or multifamily units or all the rest of it in Raleigh, because we're simply not building them in a supply great enough that the demand even seems to be there. There's a concept in economics called induced demand. When you build enough of something that you actually create more demand because there's a market signal that this is available now. And I think that we have a long way to grow in order to build enough that we are actually even meeting the demand.
And I would add that the demand for that house you're talking about, the smaller house, is out there, but those families don't have enough income. You can't build it for what it is. And even if you stripped away what the zoning regulations are, they just don't have enough income. I mean, there's a segment of folks who have been left behind, and they're working people. And if you look at the job growth, we have some really great job growth on high-end stuff, but there's a lot of people working at retail and other service industry, although a lot of people are trying to escape the service industry for more money, but they don't earn enough. And so it's a both and to look at. I mean, I'm hopeful that it's a holistic view of what we got to do here and not leave out the folks that have been struggling for quite a while.
I think we have, oh, sorry.
And I was just saying that, and that's when interest rates were 3%. So now, you imagine now, I mean, I read the other day that basically if you could afford a $500,000 house a year ago, it's now $350,000. I mean, that's how much an impact interest rates have.
All right, I think we're going to have to wrap it there. Our next panel will be back in about 10 to 15 minutes with Jordan from the Locke team, and he'll be discussing with some of our public sector folks solutions to the housing situation. Gentlemen, all three of you, thank you so much.
All right, everyone. All right, everyone. If we could come back to our seats, we can go ahead and get started with the second panel. All right. Let's just give a round of applause for the previous panel one time before we get started. That was really great discussion and really sets the stage for us. So again, my name is Jordan Roberts. I'm Director of Government Affairs here at the Locke Foundation, and I get the pleasure of hosting this all-star panel of lawmakers and leaders at the General Assembly. To introduce our panelists, going from my right to left, we have Representative Alston. Representative Alston is a North Carolina native. She received her bachelor's in political science from North Carolina State in 2004 and a JD from the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Law School in 2009. Representative Alston practiced criminal law for several years, primarily at the Center for Death Penalty Litigation in Durham, North Carolina. In 2017, she was elected to the Durham City Council. She served on the council for 2 years before being appointed to the North Carolina House of Representatives in 2020. She was elected to her first full term in the House in November of 2020. Representative Alston and her wife Courtney are raising their 2 children, Reese and Davis, in southwestern Durham County. Next, we have Senator-elect Moffitt, still finishing out his term as representative, but joining the upper chamber next year. Born and raised in the mountains of western North Carolina, Representative Moffitt is completing his 7th term in the North Carolina House. Professionally, Mr. Moffitt has been a management consultant since 1986 and founded his firm Moffitt International Incorporated in 1990. Specializing in construction and real estate development consulting, his practice has been in the multifamily arena since 2010. He is also a real estate broker and has a boutique real estate firm, Moffitt Properties. He and his wife Dina have 5 sons in their combined family ages from 25 to 31, scattered from the Carolinas to Florida and Colorado. Moffitt needs a big house. And then last but not least, we have Senator Newton. Senator Newton was born in Smithfield and grew up in Eden. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and Juris Doctorate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1982 and 1985. He graduated from the Harvard Advanced Management Program in 2008. Following law school, Senator Newton joined the Hinkle Law Firm in New Mexico for 5 years and returned to North Carolina to serve as a lawyer for Duke Power Company. Senator Newton has served the last 6 years in District 36, representing all of Cabarrus County and part of Union County. In November 2022, he was elected to his 4th term in District 34, making up most of Cabarrus County. Starting at the beginning of the 2023 session, he will serve as Senate Republican Majority Leader. Senator Newton and his wife Melanie have been married for 38 years and live in Mount Pleasant, and they also have 4 children and 4 grandchildren, also a big family. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So what I want to let you guys set the stage here is, when we think about North Carolina and the different districts, we see similar problems, but the issues can be different depending on the district and the area of the state they're in. So to start off, just go down the line here, I'd like everyone just to tell us about the housing market in your district and what types of challenges that you're seeing with the housing market.
Well, thanks, Jordan, and good afternoon, everyone. So I represent southwestern Durham County, and in Durham, as I'm sure in so many areas, particularly our urban areas, we're truly in the midst of a housing crisis. Durham has grown, I think, 20% in the last year alone. I know when I was on council, we used to cite that, every day, 20 people moved to Durham. So it's a really startling growth rate that's only going to continue. I think we're still scheduled to double in size over the next 25 years. Developable land is decreasing, as we're seeing again in so many areas across the state. Our median income, as a result of our growth, is increasing by leaps and bounds every single year, and yet even folks with higher incomes are still struggling to find housing. And so, there's more pressure on a really scarce market for our housing stock, which is then, obviously displacing people to Chatham County and Person County and Orange County, far reaches of our region, just to live and experience what we have to offer in Durham and in the Triangle. Something that was really highlighted for me when I served locally and continues to be of interest and concern for me is the inability of our local government employees to kind of live in the communities that they serve, which is an important factor, I think, at least for me to try to address. And I think the biggest takeaway for Durham, and again, I think across the state, is that we just need to build more faster, and we need the state to play a more active role in helping to make that happen. So, thanks, Jordan.
Thank you, Jordan. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the comments from the first panel, and it's good to know that Bill Rowe is amenable. I did not know that an amenable Bill Rowe actually existed. So it was actually good to see. So Asheville is probably the most widely known part of West North Carolina, and it's been attracting people for probably 30 years to the mountains. Well, the secret is out about the surrounding communities. So Henderson County, which is where I live, Hendersonville is the small town there. The housing pressure is extraordinary. If you look at these studies that they typically publish about our state, the most expensive housing typically is in our region from a single family standpoint, and we really don't see it ebbing. I wouldn't say that we feel insulated from any type of market conditions that would cause pricing to shift downward, simply because we have so many people coming to our area. What's fascinating to me is the types of people that are coming to our area. So you have a lot of baby boomers that have decided that they're tired of being overtaxed and overregulated and really frustrated with the states that they are leaving and coming to our state based on a lot of the solid decisions that we've made in our state over the last decade or so. And you have a lot of early Xers that make up that group of folks that are purchasing the property. That's not an endless supply. So I'm very concerned about the next group of potential purchasers and what impact that's going to have. But the way it is right now, we have certainly more demand for affordable housing now than we've ever had, and we need to address that, and we'll speak to some of that.
Thanks, Jordan. So, Paul Newton, Cabarrus County. And I just want to build your confidence in me by saying I am by far the least qualified person to sit on this panel. The two to my right really, really, really deeply understand this issue. But the benefit I hope to bring today is that I'm taking a new look, a fresh look at this problem from my perspective as a problem solver as a legislator. I think good government solves problems. Great government anticipates problems and solves them before they ever manifest as a problem. We're beyond great government. We're not great government. We've got to be good government on this issue because the problem is upon us. And in Cabarrus County, I'm helping the county fight. We're a high-growth county, and there are a slice of counties in North Carolina that are considered high-growth counties. And the League of Municipalities has a list of them that suffer from some problems that are encumbrances to solving this problem that have to be part of an already complex solution. And the two issues we have in Cabarrus County, number one, roads. We have declined to allow to be built a number of subdivisions off a particular road that's very desirable because it's only 2 lanes. And that road is not going to be widened for 10 years in Cabarrus County in the DOT plan. So numerous subdivisions, lots of housing that could have been built in Cabarrus County can't be built because we don't have the roads to support it. Similarly, if you've ever had to deal with wastewater issues and the constraints on growth that can create for your fast-growing county, it is very real. And when you dig beneath the surface, you will find that our DEQ, and hats off to Elizabeth Beiser, she is working with us on this issue. We've made a little progress. We need to make more. But I'm telling you, our fast-growing counties have got to get relief from the multiple conservatisms that are built in wastewater capacity calculations. If we don't, we'll have a de facto moratorium, and we can eliminate exclusionary zoning entirely today with a snap of a finger in Cabarrus, and we're going to be constrained to build any of those homes. So we've got to solve wastewater, we've got to solve road and other infrastructure issues before we can ever get to actually building these physical homes at reasonable cost.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And like Bill said, I mean, it's not just building more supply of housing. That's certainly, we believe, a very important part of it. But there's a lot of different nuances. We're not going to solve everything on this panel today, I can guarantee you that. But hopefully we talk about, some actionable items that we can take in the near future. I want to talk about some legislation from last year. We have two of the sponsors of a housing reform bill on here, but before, I want to turn to our local government expert here, Representative Alston. But, Michael Tanner mentioned in his report that we're a Dillon Rule state, and so a lot of people may be a little bit unclear about what that is. So I think it's a really important point when talking about what state government can do. So talk to us about what it means to be a Dillon Rule or hybrid Dillon Rule state, and how does that relate to the power between Raleigh and local governments?
Sure. I think I can speak best to that from my perspective as kind of a formerly locally elected official. It means that essentially, the baseline understanding is that local governments can, only act or regulate in areas that the state has given them the authority to do so. And so that's certainly the understanding that I had as a local official, and I know my colleagues at the local levels do as well. I think what that regime, I think a couple things. I think that regime offers all of us kind of in this moment a real opportunity, again, to play maybe an overdue role in addressing the crisis that I think we're confronting statewide. I think, again, I put my local government brain back on. I think locally it can make it difficult to feel like you have the flexibility and the ability to address the specific needs of your community and also of your local stakeholders. And I think, in part because of that regime, we have kind of a perfect storm right now of, we have the tools that local governments, have at their disposal to address housing affordability, frankly, aren't adequate. I think we have this development environment that is expensive and inefficient for many of our stakeholders. And, I think putting reforms in place at the state level, as it is for so many issues, is hard, and it takes long, and you have so many interests to accommodate and to account for, and so things just move slowly. And so, that said, I feel really optimistic about what we can accomplish in this moment. And if I could just delve a little bit into kind of, again, my kind of local experience. So I started on the council in Durham for about 2.5 years. And in that time, I witnessed a great deal of political will to kind of get in front of this issue in part, but also address, what was already a serious housing crisis. We passed expanding housing choices in Durham. While I was on the council, our voters passed the largest, affordable housing bond in state history. It was a $95 million bond. We established and maintain and still do a very strong working relationship with our local housing authority. We made big commitments to use publicly held land for kind of affordable housing needs. We did our best. We created property tax relief grant programs, and so we tried to get really creative and really aggressive about approaching these issues. And all the creativity in the world still is not. It's not enough. It wasn't enough then, and it isn't enough now to address this massive problem. And so we need more efficient processes. We need the private sector. We need to invite the private sector to be, a much bigger player in addressing these problems. And so we do that by building relationships with, our builders, our investors, by creating incentives that work. We have a lot of work to do. And I think, obviously being a Dillon Rule state kind of gives us that opportunity from this kind of position.
Yeah, and so I mentioned there was legislation last year. Michael talks about it in his report. It was Senate Bill 349 and House Bill 401. We have two of the sponsors of the legislation up here. So I want to talk to you gentlemen about some of the specifics in there. So Senator Moffitt, I'll start with you. I mean, one of the big parts and criticisms of the bill was it effectively legalized all different types of housing use on any residential properties. Some people call that middle housing, so it essentially legalized middle housing. So, how did the bill get at that, and how does middle housing alleviate housing shortages across the state?
How much time do I have? I'll digress just for a moment, then I'll speak to the question. So when it comes to the subject matter, affordable housing, I look at it as a three-legged stool, but actually I'll add a couple of legs to it. So you have a supply issue. So free market typically helps alleviate some of the stress on affordability if you have more supply. You have a cost to market issue. What does it actually cost to get that unit to market, to make it available for the folks in your community? Wage pressure. So when you're talking about affordable housing, it's an inability for the folks earning a wage in your community to afford the pricing of the houses there. Then the other two things that, and I really won't speak to these too much, but on the other side of the spectrum, you have a generation of folks that don't feel like home ownership is going to be part of their life plan. They can't afford to buy the homes in their communities. And what's unique about our country is the ability to own private property and our ability to travel freely throughout our country. And most countries don't provide that. But I'm concerned that we have, especially with millennials, a large portion of the millennials don't feel like home ownership is going to be part of their financial plan. And I think that's not a good thing for our society, and we need to look at that. But that's also being frustrated because we have these large hedge funds out of Wall Street that are coming in and they're buying neighborhoods at 30 and 40% above market rate. I can't quite figure out why, unless their intent is to really keep a certain portion of our population always renting and never able to accumulate that personal wealth that you would get through home ownership. So those are for another meeting. So when you're looking at the bill, House Bill 401 and Senate Bill 349, what it attempted to do was take the government addresses housing this way. You have single-family housing, then anything above that is considered multifamily housing. But in the real world, anything that's 5 units or higher is considered multifamily. Then you have your single family. Then you have what we would consider a middle housing arena, which is going to be duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. It could be double flats. It could be A2 housing, which is two apartments in a single family residence. So it takes on a different meaning. And what that bill attempted to do was look at not planned developments where you have a homeowners association, but looking at other areas of municipalities where you could adopt a zoning solution that would allow for the construction of a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex in the same row of houses, single family houses. And what that was attempting to do was really look toward providing a solution for folks to be able to afford a home. So if you were able to build a duplex in a neighborhood and a family moved into one part, right, then they could rent out the other part. So over a course of time, they could really develop that into a single family home at some point, but it's a way to get them into the home ownership arena. There's a lot of concern regarding that because people were really fretting what that would look like for their neighborhood. If they've got a nice single family home, then all of a sudden you have this horrible looking triplex next to you that is going to devalue your home. I'm sensitive to that. In my first tour of duty, we addressed aesthetics regarding how municipalities tried to regulate aesthetics in residential areas. And we passed a bill which pretty much eliminates their ability to do that, but through conditional use, they're imposing aesthetic controls that way. But I've been to a lot of communities and I've seen these large homes where, in the 40s and 50s, people had 8, 9, 10 kids, right? So they had these huge homes, and these homes were converted from a single family home into multiple apartments. But on the outside, it looks like a single family home, but on the inside it operates in a much different way. So I kind of felt, through some modest, I just want to say some modest influence on aesthetics, that would make that bill more palatable, because I just don't trust our municipalities to not abuse that power if we were to relegate it back to them. So that made the bill very difficult to get passed. But it was really designed to increase in a very responsible way the amount of housing supply that's out there. Now, it did not address amalgamation or when you're deconstructing a double flat into a single flat. It didn't address that, and that's something that we need to look at in the future, because you do have people that are wanting to take available units off the market and turn that 4-unit apartment building in a nice area of town and make it a single-family home, which is going to reduce the supply. So I think that's something that we have to, be aware of at least.
Yeah, and you make a point about the value of homes, and I've seen some research where the more use you can have out of your land, multifamily housing, splitting up the lot size, what the research shows is that the value actually increases because developers look at it and there's more value to it because they can do more with it. So it's an interesting.
And I will say this: we had a lot of complaints about parking because people were concerned about if you have multiple units, you're going to have multiple cars. Well, unless you've had 5 sons driving with friends, our single-family home looked like a used car lot for probably 10 years straight. So the parking issue really was not something that concerned me greatly in regards to the middle housing solution.
Sure. So, Senator, you brought up roads, water, sewer, all of these sort of ancillary things that come with housing, and I wanted to talk about the permitting process and the way local governments can impose things during that process, like impact fees. So, talk to us about that and how local governments can, or how that can be reformed to increase development and get more construction going.
Sure. So I've got personal experience with this because several years ago, I sought zoning change, conditional use permit to build a wedding venue in the middle of nowhere. It's in Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, very rural, no neighbor. Like I said, we don't want to disturb the neighbors. My wife's like, we don't have any neighbors. But I went out and I met with all the neighbors, no objections. All the farmers, no objections. But I cannot explain the torture chamber that planning and zoning is, unless you've been there yourself or you've represented people that have gone through planning and zoning. It is ridiculous. Common sense leaves the building. There are fiefdoms there. I mean, I'll never forget, I could give you so many examples, but I'll give you one. The parking lot had to be in grass, and again, middle of nowhere. It had to be a grass parking lot, and you had to line it with trees, and it couldn't be visible from the little 2-lane road that 15 cars go up and down per day on. And I won the tree battle because the farmer that farmed my land said, well, we don't want no trees there. We want to be able to farm from my land to his land without the encumbrance of trees. But and then when it became to the visibility of the parking lot from the one little 2-lane road, we had a commissioner that sat there and said, I'm on my iPad. I think you can see that parking lot from the road. Go get an engineer and do a visual check, a line of sight check for me that proves, let's delay this 30 days. They have no concept that time is money. It is horrific, and it is real that it adds real costs and time and cost to any building project. So it's real. If you don't believe that, please go sit in on a planning and zoning hearing for any builder that wants to build something. It's fascinating to me the lack of will to solve this problem at the local government level. And I'm not in fact, Durham County is a shining star. Wake County, a shining star. They've actually taken steps to try to address this. So thank you for doing that and showing the way. But I understand, as of this morning, that affordable housing is not even on the legislative agenda for the Association of County Commissioners. Why is this a burning platform for us here today, but it's not for, and I don't know whether it's on the League of Municipalities schedule of priorities or not. It should be. And so when we're talking about a supply problem, this is a supply problem created directly by government. We're naive if we don't think the very zoning restrictions that are in place today on single-family homes, size of the lots, one house per lot, limitations on vertical growth of housing. It has been a supply problem created directly by government. So here we are talking about how government needs to reform government so the private sector can do its job. I guarantee you that the private sector will fill this void if we unleash them to do that. But they cannot do that with today's planning and zoning laws. And that's back to our bill. I mean, we're taking the heavy lift. Look, think of it this way, if you're a local government unit. We're trying to make things easy for you with this bill. It's going to come back up. Some form of it's going to come back up this session. We're going to be the bad guys. We understand the local pressure you face to not relax zoning restrictions with respect to your local voters. We get that. You should do it. Durham did it. It can be done, but there doesn't seem to be the will to fight this issue at the local level that there should be. It's a great example of talking the talk and not walking the walk. It just is, and I'm sorry if I offended you by that, but I hear a lot of talk about this, but when it comes time to fix it, in fact, we had a bill that ensured energy choice for every home in North Carolina. It would have, Dillon's rule state said, hey, by the way, we're going to proactively let you know, local government unit, you can't exclude natural gas from as a fuel source for a home. And the studies show it's less expensive for a homeowner to heat with natural gas than a heat pump. But the governor vetoed that bill. We've got to start walking the walk in North Carolina if we want to make a difference, local government and state government. So, I think going to solutions, this is a complex problem that's going to require stakeholder involvement from the league, from the counties, from state government, and we're going to have to solve not only the zoning issue, but assuming the zoning issue were removed completely, what about those roads? What about that wastewater capacity? What other encumbrances are there to actually building these? Because if you're tapped out on wastewater capacity in your fast-growing county, it doesn't matter what happens to the zoning laws or how much willingness there is to build the unit if you can't support that unit in your infrastructure.
Yeah, I was trying to think. I think it was an article recently in the Assembly, but the quote was something like, I don't understand how the people with housing have convinced the people without housing that the people that are building housing, they're the issue. So, but great points there. So we got a couple more minutes, and, Mike talked about a lot of different reforms, middle housing, reforming parking minimums, minimum square footage, lot sizes, setback, aesthetic mandates. We have all these different types of tools in our toolbox. But last question to each of you: if you could pick one legislative solution that you think would alleviate housing supply across the state, what would you choose?
Well, I think the first thing I'll say, I'll sound like a politician, but I think there's no one solution. But that said, I think, and this probably won't come as a surprise, I think, putting in place the kind of reform that would allow, duplexes, single-family townhomes, ADUs, where single-family zoning already exists, I think is an important and simple fix. And again, it tracks what we did in Durham and what we tried to educate our community about. It's a tailored approach. It's important not only for the continued viability of our county and our region, but I think it's going to be an important kind of cultural shift towards density that we're going to have to make statewide.
Very good. Well, Senator Newton, for somebody who doesn't know a lot about what he's talking about, he did an excellent job.
Good, yeah.
So not to sound like Representative Austin and overly political, government can either be a complicating factor or it can be a mitigating factor. And I think that we have to look at the state level through what are the steps that we need to just kind of assess it. What's a complicating factor and address it? What's a mitigating factor and kind of bolster that? And even do that kind of review at the local level. But if I had one particular, one?
Just one.
That's tough.
One. I know.
I'd probably eliminate conditional zoning and the use of exactions because it simply throws an inordinate cost on the project itself, which is going to be passed on to the ultimate homeowner or the person that's going to be renting the home.
Yeah, so my solution, if I had to pick only one, would be to work with local government units to alleviate the zoning prohibitions that don't allow these other middle housing options. I do want to put this is a great thing about being up here. You actually can't control what I answer, so you answer what you want to. But I want to put a pitch in for my home county. One of the things that they've done that other counties, other cities may want to do is City of Concord has formed a 501c3. that can receive grants, and they got $5 million grant from the county. And what they're doing is they're finding plots of land that are in trouble, dilapidated housing, that sort of thing. They're buying those lots, or the city may already own that lot, and they're building affordable housing with a builder to manage that. And then they're allowing people to come in at very low rental rates or home ownership rates on a 99-year lease. So they don't have to pay for the property. The city continues, or the nonprofit continues to own the property. You know, we'll see how that works. It sounds like a great idea. There are 75 units that are on the drawing board of affordable housing in Cabarrus County right now because of this idea. And I don't know if it's of interest to you. J.C. McKenzie in City of Concord is sort of the guy behind all this, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions about that.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have. Again, we could keep going, but let's turn it over to some questions. I think we're going to go to Brene. We got a couple online.
Yes, we have 2 questions online. The first one comes from Kelly. She asked, you mentioned Dillon's rule. She asked, do local jurisdictions have the right to institute inclusionary zoning? And is this something the legislature is considering allowing, if not?
So our understanding, and my continued understanding, is that local governments cannot enact inclusionary zoning. You know, as I understand it, I think there's some jurisdictions who have challenged that or are challenging that, but you know, it was our kind of operating understanding that that's prohibited in North Carolina. In terms of whether that's not something that, you know, folks in the legislature are pursuing, I have not been a part of any of those conversations, but that doesn't mean they're not happening. I'll say that.
And the second question we have is from Bo. He asks, is there a law that requires or mentions HOA requirements for new developments of a certain size?
I don't believe there is.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. I mean, HOAs are private contracts, and that's a different bird.
HOAs are a completely different subject altogether.
That's next week's panel.
Thursday and Friday.
Right here.
Great. Thank you all for the conversation. Really appreciate it. I had one comment, one question. One is in my view, the fascinating part about housing and housing policy is how it's all connected with other aspects. So I remember we built a project early on in Durham, and I was speaking at the Durham downtown bid, and they asked, you know, what can we do as a city to attract more investment in the community? And everybody said different things. And I said, if y'all had the best schools in the state, you wouldn't have to worry about attracting folks who want to live there. And so I think, you know, sometimes the conversation about housing is, you know, if different parts of cities and different parts of the communities had better schools, it would, you know, move people to other parts and other communities. That's my one comment. My one question is, from what I'm hearing, a lot of the conversation is focused on supply, and that's great. I'm all for increasing supply, but you know, we were also talking about earlier that there is a math problem, and so if it costs you, $230,000 to build a home, and all a person can afford is $125,000, you do have that gap. And I was wondering, you know, that's when much of the federal funds can bridge that gap. But I was wondering, you know, what are y'all thinking also on helping folks, you know, here and now that can't wait for the supply to really bridge the gap between wages and what the current cost of housing is?
Good question. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think there's a lot that folks and jurisdictions have already tried. I know something that we confronted locally is just a low take-up rate. You know, we instituted a density bonus to try to encourage, you know, the provision of affordable housing units to, you know, help serve that kind of population. And, you know, the take-up rate is like 0, unfortunately. So those kinds of incentives have not been super effective. You know, and again, in Durham, we've tried to, you know, leverage, you know, the bond that we passed and, you know, just our community development efforts to support the efforts of our local housing authority, which is, you know, obviously supported by HUD, but trying to work together in partnership to preserve, you know, existing affordable units, and try to, build as many new units as we can. I think we've got like 600 or so kind of new units in the pipeline, but that still doesn't even come close to addressing the needs that we have. We've also tried, and I think folks need to do more of, is in working with and helping, landlords and nonprofit developers. But again, just that these are not organizations or entities that can move quickly or produce units quickly. So we're really these are just drops in the bucket of servicing that community or that kind of population, and therefore the larger issue.
The supply issue is very real, and we do not have sufficient enough supply to really affect overall pricing of the homes themselves. If you have more homes than you have buyers, then the price will come down. To try to interrupt that through some type of program, I think is very difficult because there is a real cost to building the homes. You really can't build anything sufficient unless it's probably $250,000 in most jurisdictions across the state. So that price alone is out of reach of a lot of folks in your local communities, and I'm not sure if there's a role for government between, to try to fill that gap and what that would look like, because again, you'd be subsidizing, taking from others to provide for some, and it creates its own problems outside of that. So I think the supply issue and the cost to market are things that we can probably readily address through some things from Raleigh. I'm not sure that we would be bad guys in as much as innovative thinkers and willing to make the tough decisions. But those are something. But also, we need to address the burden of government on the taxpayers. We often look at wage limitations in our communities, but we never look at the burden of government that's a part of that wage structure. So is local government too big? Is it too costly? Does it create its own unintended consequences because it does require monies to support itself? Same thing at the county level, same thing at the state level. Are we really looking at lessening the burden of the cost of governance and being as efficient as we can be to where we're lifting people up by not necessarily trying to impose higher wages, but reducing the cost within their wage structure as it exists now. So I think there's some things to think about.
Well, if somebody came up to me and said, I've got this great job in downtown Raleigh, but I can't afford to live there, what would I say? I mean, when I moved back to North Carolina and had a job in downtown Charlotte, I thought housing was unaffordable in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. So I drove 30 minutes away by interstate up to Cabarrus County, and housing was more affordable. And so I commuted for 25 years, better part of 25 years, to and from downtown Charlotte. It's better for my kids, not so great for me because I'm driving. It's not, it's not the urban utopia to have people driving in. But if somebody came to me today and said, I can't afford to live in Raleigh, what do? I'd say, well, let's get creative about finding somebody who might rent a basement room to you if you want to live downtown. But in the meantime, you also ought to look out. I mean, there are, within 20 minutes of most of our downtowns, there are tier 1 and 2 counties that, frankly, housing is not as expensive, right, as it is in Wake County. 20 or 40 minutes for sure. And I'm not saying that's a permanent solution, but I'm saying that as a practical matter, that's a hardship to have to drive, but you can drive and find something less expensive than in the heart of downtown Raleigh or downtown Charlotte. That's kind of where we are near term. And I just want to go on record. I don't know that it's right that local government units don't have the authority to eliminate zoning that we gave them the authority to put in place. Is that what you were saying you didn't have the authority to do?
To eliminate zoning?
Yeah.
Oh, no, just inclusionary.
Oh, just inclusionary, okay. All right, because when we delegated that, I mean, that probably delegated the basket of decision-making around zoning. And so I just don't want this group to think, well, this is all a state issue because of Dillon's rule. I mean, it's not necessarily.
Back here. Representative Brody.
Thank you very much. And And I look at Tim. He sat behind me in the General Assembly, and we've talked this issue to death. I think we could probably both agree that we've talked that to death. But having going through this locally, two issues that always come up: roads and schools. And that's from the person who walks up to you after the meeting and says, pokes you in the chest and says, "What are we going to do about roads? What are we going to do about schools?" Well, schools are an integral part. I mean, this has been an issue since I think I remember my parents talking about that when I was going to school, all the cost of schools, and we got to, the taxes and all that stuff. So this is something going to go on. But roads is something interesting, and Senator Newton said something interesting, and it's that they turned down subdivisions because of the two-lane road. And I asked myself, well, what was the problem? Yeah, it's a two-lane road. Okay. In our ability, in our structure to decide who gets the roads improved next, it's based on need. It's based on certain metrics. And the more you put on a road, the higher up it gets onto the metric of being able to get adjusted. So that's kind of a red herring issue a lot of times. But the other one is, interestingly, is wastewater. And you mentioned that too. But and the only reason I'm saying it is because I'm hoping some municipalities are listening, because you guys are preaching to the choir. But it's the ability of a municipality to decide, I'm just not going to build it. It's not going to go there. Or if I'm going there, it's going to be years down the road and whatever. So Representative Moffitt and I had these conversations about alternatives. And a lot of legislation I work on are when we come into these roadblocks, what alternatives can we put in there to keep the system moving? And alternatives means subdivision, wastewater systems, and things like that type of system where you can create the density and you can still move forward. The problem is communities around, especially around where I'm at, they won't allow those either. They don't allow alternatives, but they won't build the system in order for you to expand. The other issue on that very thing is DEQ itself. I mean, they've got rules upon rules upon rules to tell you how you can't do something, and I've run across some that listen to these concerns, but the rules built in just prohibit this. Last thing I just want to mention this isn't a party issue. The issue itself does not say one party against the other. The issue is those who believe in this and those who don't believe in expanding. And that's real important, because sometimes you're fighting your own party people to get something that should be done. And thanks, guys. I appreciate what you do.
Senator Newton. So those comments really prompted something in my mind. It goes to the wage issue. We're talking a lot about, assisting low-income residents to seek the American dream, to own their first home and move up. The best way to increase income so that American dream becomes possible is to bring great jobs to North Carolina so that they can move up that economic ladder. And we're doing a great job of that. We're getting a lot of job creators that want to move to North Carolina because they know they can prosper here. The problem that we've got, and this is a different way of looking at this issue and why we've got to solve it in a bipartisan way, is that you've got EDPNC, Economic Development Partnership in North Carolina, you've got Commerce, and their goal is to land that fish. But our implicit promise in making North Carolina available, promoting North Carolina for them to come create those jobs, our implicit promise is that you're going to have the workforce, and your workforce is going to have a place to live. And when we're not creating the housing that is going to allow their employees to live and prosper here in North Carolina, we're failing all those new job creators as well. We're not only failing those who need and want to move up the economic ladder, but we're failing those job creators. So this is not sustainable. People will stop bringing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 person jobs to North Carolina if we're not building affordable housing for those employees to live in. So we got a lot of reasons to solve this problem.
Maybe one more, if there is one.
Thank you all very much, and I want to build on something that that Representative Brody said, is that, and also Senator Newton, that this has to be effectively a bipartisan solution. So as we're coming into the next session, I think ask all three of the panelists, what do you see as a critical way? I think we're starting by doing it here. We're having these conversations in a bipartisan manner, and there's conservatives, liberals, libertarians in this room who are all talking about the same thing. What do you see as some potential barriers to preventing consensus? We've already talked about bills where the governor has vetoed, or members of your own party, whether YIMBY, NIMBY, what have you, who would oppose this. What do you see as some potential barriers, but then what might be solutions, particularly in this next upcoming biennium, where we can overcome some of those legislative barriers to maybe find consensus legislation that'll actually get across the finish line, whether that's through being signed on the governor's desk, or maybe even a fun veto override or something like that?
I'm not sure if that actually has an answer.
Well, I'll give you one.
Yeah.
I'll give you one. The lag time in solving this problem is so great that every stakeholder needs their hair on fire about this issue, and they don't.
I think there's a lack of understanding. I think that Senate Bill 349, House Bill 401, was the narrative around that very early was a narrative that was not actually the intent of the bill. Then when HUD got involved with their federal approach to zoning, then it really kind of doomed our efforts there. So I think, speaking clearly about what our intentions are, we've always worked in a bipartisan way, so I don't think that that's going to be a particular issue. But it's making sure that the folks that are interpreting the legislative language are doing so the correct way and in the spirit in which it's offered.
Sure. I think doing this, starting the conversation and the process in a bipartisan way will help us, frankly, educate and work with all of our stakeholders who, again, have a wide variety of interests. I think biggest of which being our local governments, whose interests I can understand. And so I think bridging that gap and working to bridge that gap early, I think is huge. Not revolutionary idea, but I think it's going to be important here.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to have to cut it there. We can keep going all afternoon, but let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks.
Alrighty, everyone. This is the last time that I'll be taking the podium this afternoon. Again, thank you all so very much, and thank you to all 6 of our panelists, both from the private and public sector, for joining us today. We encourage you to stick around. This is going to be a continuing issue for conversation, not just for today, but as you enter the biennium here in North Carolina. We do really appreciate everyone's interest coming from different perspectives. And we're going to try to foster that today with a reception that's going to start in about 5 minutes. You're welcome to join us. The bar has started to arrive, so that'll be exciting. And if you have any questions for either myself for the Cato team or Jordan from the Locke team, we're very happy to work with you. And again, thank you so much for your interest in keeping housing affordable in North Carolina. Have a great afternoon, everybody. I'll see you at the reception.